Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a subscriber ask a question, and he wants to know, hey Jason, does a person have to do rear delt work if they're rowing a lot? Let's say they're rowing more than they're pressing. Is it really necessary to train your rear delts? So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. And that's a good question because, again, rear delts are oftentimes a weakness for people, and I don't always mean a weakness in the bodybuilder sense. They might be in the bodybuilder sense, but that's not really what I want to talk about on this channel. Are they a potential weakness for injuries for many people? Yes. And that comes down to the fact that a lot of people press more than they pull. Not just more weight, but more overall volume, more overall times a week. So they tend to overdevelop the muscles on the front of their torso more. Same people oftentimes struggle with back development versus, say, their chest or their delts, because they're doing more pressing than they are pulling. Well, that tends to cause shoulder girdle imbalances, weak rear delts, things like that, and accordingly, that can get people hurt when they're pressing, meaning having really weak rear delts can reduce the stability in your shoulder joint. It can lead to shoulder injuries when you're doing heavy pressing. So from an injury prevention perspective, having strong, well-developed rear delts is a good idea. So that's the reason it's often advised that people do extra work for this, extra pulling work, extra rear delt work. But the question we get into is it necessary? Well, good question. A lot of it comes down to, is it going to cause additional development? I think that's the biggest question, because it's not even just an issue of, are you pulling more than you're pushing in terms of volume every week? Because even if your front side, your front delts and chest and everything are overdeveloped because you're simply stronger on those exercises, because you've put more focus on them, doesn't mean you're going to automatically correct the issue with just doing more volume on the pulling now. It's still an issue of relative strength, everything else going on. So it's kind of a complicated question. And the question that I would ask, because that's a good starting point. If you're pulling more than you're pushing, probably a good start for ensuring that you're going to have a healthy shoulder girdle. It's a good start. Not everything, but it's a good start. Well, the real question I would ask is, are you maximizing the development of the rear delt? And I don't mean the bodybuilder approach of throwing everything but the kitchen sink at a muscle and hoping that it grows. It's about, are you optimizing volume, and how much of your volume is geared towards hypertrophy versus motor unit learning. What I mean is, are you doing more than about 10 to 12 sets of full range of motion training for any given muscle already? That's the real question, because for most people, that's where maximum growth is going to occur. And people need to understand not everyone's goal is maximum growth. All right, it's not necessary to have maximum growth in every muscle in your body. In some cases, it's not even ideal to have maximum muscle growth in every muscle in your body. But there are certain muscles it's probably a good idea, things like rear delts, and that could come back to, I don't care what your goals are. That one even applies to bodybuilders. The reason I say that, how many bodybuilders, particularly amateurs in their little endeavor, end up getting scored down for having bad rear delts. Having underdeveloped rear delts is actually fairly common from what I understand. Talking to bodybuilders I've known over the years, that's fairly common even in their endeavor. But from a sports perspective, that's a muscle you should probably be ensuring maximum growth on. Well, I would say if you're already doing 10 to 12 sets of full range of motion work, you're probably not stimulating any additional growth there. All right, so that's kind of what we need to consider here is it getting maximum stimulation already? So if you're doing dead hang chin-ups, is that working the rear delt through the full range of motion? You know, sometimes partial reps don't always work a muscle because we're not necessarily getting all the performance elements. We're not getting joint angle specificity of the entire range that the muscle is capable of. And for injury prevention, you want a muscle that you need as some sort of stabilizer. You want it to be strong through everything. Hamstrings, rear delts, things like that. These are muscles that if you're wanting to avoid getting hurt, it's probably a good idea to make sure that they are strong in every joint angle. This is one of those muscles that falls into that category. So you've got to ask, are you doing partials? Or are you just doing some partial rows way upright? Or are you actually bent over pretty far and going all the way to the bottom, all the way up? That's going to be a big difference. That's going to make a big difference. Because if you're doing partials, you might need to come in and do some extra work. But if you're doing full range of motion rowing, to where you're actually stretching at the bottom, contracting at the top because you're going through the full range of motion on the exercise, or you're doing dead hang chin-ups, You're not going to see any growth in any muscle beyond about 10 to 12 sets a week. I don't care what you're doing. Not going to happen. Don't let anyone tell you it's going to grow more. You might be working it more, but it's not growing more. Beyond that, you're just not going to see additional growth. So that's where I would start. Is you're rowing a good, respectable range of motion, or you're doing some little cheat rows where you're pulled really high upright at beyond a 45-degree angle, or are you actually bent over enough to get the rear delts stimulated? And are you working them through the full range of motion? But if the answer is yes to that, and you know you're doing 10 to 12 sets already, you're probably not going to see any benefits from doing rear delt work. Not saying you can't throw it in, but you need to avoid that bodybuilder approach of endless volume, throwing everything but the kitchen sink at a muscle, because at a certain point, a muscle just is not growing because you're working it more. More work equals more growth up to a certain threshold, and then it starts to taper off real quick. And if you're working it with so much volume then that it's not even stimulating growth, that it's slowing down recovery, you can't train the muscle as often. If you can't train it as often, it's not going to grow as fast either. You've got to be able to keep recovery and workload at a threshold that you can recover from in a reasonable time frame. Meaning, if you're working your rear delt so much with extra rear delt work that you can only do heavy rows once every 6 or 7 days for several work sets, that's a problem if they're actually a limiting factor. So it comes to a point of stimulating maximum growth. Now, as a side note, there are things for training beyond maximum growth. So people will say, well, I remember when you were doing 30 sets of bench press, 30 sets of squat every week. Were those muscles growing from that? You seem to contradict yourself. Well, here's the thing. I wasn't doing that for extra muscle growth. That's more volume than is necessary to stimulate maximum growth. All right, I was doing a lot of triples of what we call accumulation work. A lot of that had to do with training motor unit learning. Was I stimulating maximum muscle growth in those muscles? Yeah, probably. All the muscles involved in the squat and the bench press? Sure. Sure, I was also doing 30 sets of rows every week during that accumulation training too. 30 sets of Pendlay rows was pretty common for me. But that comes down to motor unit learning. I was training myself to be more explosive on first reps. If you do large numbers of doubles and triples, you get more first reps in. You improve your motor patterns in the low rep range. Because you're doing, let's say you're doing 30 triples through the course of a week, 3 sets of 10, 3 times a week on an exercise. You're setting up for 30 different sets every week. You're doing 30 first reps every week. If you're training to be a power lifter, for example, you want to get good at first reps. So if you're getting that much practice setting up your squat for a decently heavy weight, getting that much practice setting up your bench, you're ingraining 30 first reps every week while getting your workload in. All right, you're training motor patterns, you're training motor unit learning. That is not the same as stimulating muscle growth. That's just practice, 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 practice. Because there is also a practice component to getting better at a skill. Now, a lot of people say, well, couldn't you do the same thing for rear delts? No, not really, because rear delts don't have a complex motor pattern involved. The bench press has a curve to it. It has multiple muscles involved. Think how many major muscles are involved in the bench press. Anterior delts, pecs, triceps. Those are the primary movers with a lot of stabilizers. There's a motor pattern to be learned to use those muscles in conjunction for them to take over and get more load at different points in the exercise, become more efficient at the movement. Rear delt exercises are very, very simple. There's not a lot of motor unit learning. It's a fairly small muscle. It doesn't have any complex motor patterns to it. The rear delt does one thing and one thing only. Pecs can do several different things because they can move at different angles. They have a lot of different points of insertion. Rear delts have almost no points of insertion. There's minimal insertion points. The muscle is just strongest at a certain angle, and that's it. So if you're working it sufficiently, there's no benefit to getting stronger at maxes on it. In other words, doing large numbers of sets to improve motor skills just isn't useful on the rear delts. Not on a little simple muscle like that with only a couple of insertion points. Particularly a small muscle like that, it's more of a stabilizer. You're not going to benefit from that. It's more complex exercises like a squat, a bench press, things like that. Those have a motor pattern. They have a learning curve involved, right? Just like throwing a baseball is a complex movement. It's something you need to practice repeatedly to master the technique. And to keep your motor pattern sharp and honed, you need to do lots of throwing to get good at it. It's a skill. A lot of big exercises are a skill. Also, yes, they stimulate muscle growth, but they have a skill component. Rear delts don't have that. So accordingly, there's no real benefit to doing like sport-specific training to get really skilled at using your rear delts on an exercise. All you really care about is their ability to stabilize, which just requires you to make them grow. And if you're doing at least 10 really good full range of motion sets for them on one or two different exercises, a simple muscle like that is going to grow as fast as it can. So it all comes down to how much volume you're doing. Now, if you're not doing that much volume when you're pulling, back to the point, yeah, you might benefit from throwing in some rear delt exercises. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.